What I am about to describe was redacted from every official record. My name does not exist in the expedition files. Neither does Warrant Officer Brandt's, nor Dr. Voss's. We were erased, not because we failed the mission but because we came back knowing something the governments of the world have spent 90 years agreeing to forget. The Arctic did not kill us. What lives inside the Arctic almost did something far worse. It almost made us understand. And understanding, I now know, is the last thing we were ever supposed to do. The room smelled of burned paper and something older. Something institutional. The kind of smell that clings to places where decisions are made and then unmade. It was January 1933. Berlin was holding its breath. The newspapers were full of a name that everyone said aloud but no one quite believed yet, and in that narrow window between one era ending and another beginning, in that exact crack of political blindness, they sent us north. I was 31 years old. I had served 6 years in the Wehrmacht's Geographical Survey Division, which meant I had spent 6 years in bad weather carrying equipment I didn't fully understand, following orders I wasn't meant to question. This, I was told, would be no different. The briefing room was 3 floors below street level in a building on Wilhelmstrasse with no exterior markings. The officer who delivered our orders was a man whose name I was told once and told immediately to forget. He wore no insignia I recognized. He spoke in the flat, affectless tone of someone reading a laundry list, which is precisely how he described an expedition into the high Arctic shelf as a routine meteorological survey. 12 men. 1 Soviet-seized icebreaker. 6 weeks. Coordinates that, when I later checked against every published map I could find, simply did not exist on any of them. He slid a photograph across the table. Aerial. Wide angle. A vast, featureless field of white ice stretching to a horizon that blurred into gray sky. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that justified the sealed crates being loaded onto the ship, or the 2 scientists attached to our unit, or the fact that the document folder he'd handed me had already been partially burned at the corners. Deliberately, I realized, because the margins contained handwriting someone had decided we should never read. I almost slid the photograph back. Then I noticed it. In the lower left corner of the image, nearly swallowed by the white, was a shadow. Dark, distinct, spreading across the ice in a long, irregular shape. I searched the photograph for its source. A cloud, a ridge, an aircraft. Nothing. The sky above that spot was clear. The ice around it was flat. A shadow with no origin. I looked up. The officer had already looked away. A printing error, he said before I'd spoken. It happens. We shipped out from Bremerhaven 4 days later. 11 soldiers, 2 scientists, Dr. Ingrid Voss, a glaciologist from Heidelberg whose papers on polar ice stratification I had been instructed to read, and whose demeanor suggested she had not slept voluntarily in several years. And Dr. Franz Maurer, a physicist who carried 3 notebooks and spoke to no one during the entire sea crossing. And Petrov, the Soviet liaison. A compact, watchful man with eyes the color of pack ice who had been attached to our unit by some diplomatic arrangement nobody explained, and who spent the first 2 days at sea reading a document written in Cyrillic that he kept face down on the table whenever anyone approached. On the morning of the 3rd day, I saw him look at the horizon and go very still. Not frightened. Something more controlled than fright. Recognition maybe. Or resignation. I told myself the shadow in the photograph was a printing error. I tell myself a great many things I no longer believe. The coordinates brought us to a place that was on no map. What waited for us there had been waiting for considerably longer than maps have existed. There are landscapes that feel abandoned. Then there are landscapes that feel like they are waiting. The difference is subtle, but it lives in the body, not the mind. We made landfall, if you could call it that, on the 6th day. The ice shelf extended outward from a low gray coastline in a near-perfect plain, flat in a way that felt engineered rather than natural. No ridges, no pressure fissures, no sastrugi. Just an enormous white expanse, utterly still, under a sky the color of old pewter. The silence was the first wrong thing. In the Arctic there is always wind. Always the groan of shifting ice, the distant percussion of calving glaciers, the shriek of seabirds. Here, nothing. We stood at the ice edge and the silence pressed against our ears like cotton. "It's too quiet," said Corporal Hessler. And everyone looked at him and nobody disagreed. The compasses were wrong. I noticed it within the hour. The needles weren't spinning, that I might have explained as localized magnetic interference. They were leaning. All 12 compasses, checked independently, 11 degrees off vertical, all tilting in the same direction, straining like dogs on a leash toward something beneath the ice to the northeast. Maurer measured the deviation twice. He wrote the number down. He didn't share his expression when he did it. On the first afternoon, Voss began drilling ice cores. What she pulled from the first drill, a cylinder of layered ice 2 meters long, made her go silent for a very long time. She held it up to the gray light and turned it slowly, reading the striations like a physician reads an X-ray. The layering compressed in the middle section showed what she later explained to me, very quietly, as temporal impossibility. Ice deposits that should not have formed for another 40,000 years, compressed into a shelf that was by all geological indicators less than 8 centuries old. The layers were in the wrong order. Not randomly wrong. Precisely inverted. Like time ran backward here, she said, and her voice had no inflection at all. At some point, in some localized event, time ran backward. I asked her what could cause that. She put the core sample back in its case and walked away. That night, Petrov burned his personal journal. I watched him from 20 feet away, crouched over a small camp stove, feeding pages into the flame with the focused attention of a man completing a necessary task. He didn't look furtive. He looked relieved. When he noticed me watching, he met my eyes for a long moment, then looked back at the fire. The page curling in the heat showed the last line of his final entry. A single sentence in Cyrillic I couldn't read. I asked our translator later. He went pale and said it translated approximately as, "It is the same place." The temperature dropped that night in a pattern that took me until morning to identify as a sequence. 2 degrees. Then 4. Then 8. Geometric. Each drop arriving with the precision of a metronome at 90-minute intervals, as though something was calibrating the cold, testing a threshold, dialing down the warmth of the world like a man adjusting a valve. On the second morning, Private Shell photographed the horizon for the expedition log. When the photograph was developed inside the ship that evening, we gathered around it under the lamp, and Shell made a sound I had never heard from a soldier before. The horizon in the image was curved. Not the gentle curve of a spherical planet's edge. Wrong direction. The horizon bent inward. Concave. Like the photograph had been taken from inside a bowl. Like the horizon was not an edge but a rim. Maurer took the photograph from Shell's hands and studied it for a long time without speaking. Then he opened his notebook and wrote something down, capped his pen, and placed the photograph very carefully in his breast pocket. Dr. Voss said the ice core samples were temporally impossible. Maurer said she was wrong. By the third day, Maurer had stopped talking entirely. Science is supposed to be the thing that holds when everything else breaks. I watched science break on the third day quietly and completely, the way a support beam breaks. Not with drama but with a soft, definitive crack that means everything above it is now falling. Maurer set up his field station on the ice 200 meters from camp. A gravity meter, a barometer, a magnetometer, a portable spectrographic unit, and his 3 notebooks. He worked in silence for 12 hours. When he came back to camp that evening, he sat down at the mess table, placed his notebooks face down, and stared at the condensation ring his coffee mug left on the surface for almost 4 minutes before he spoke. "The gravitational constant is wrong," he said. "Not fluctuating. Not anomalous. Wrong. It fluctuates by 0.3% on a 6-hour cycle. Perfect sine wave. No geological mechanism produces that pattern. No geological mechanism produces any regular cycle." He paused. "It's a pulse." He said the word flatly, as a physicist describes a measurement. Not metaphorically. A pulse. Regular, rhythmic, predictable. Something beneath us, beneath the ice, beneath whatever geological structures lay below, was producing a gravitational oscillation as consistent and organic as a heartbeat. The radio transmissions were worse. Shell ran the set that night, attempting to reach Berlin on our scheduled frequency. The transmission went out. 14 minutes later, our own receiver captured it back. Our voices, our exact words played back to us with 14 minutes of delay, wrapped in a static that, when Voss recorded and slowed it down by a factor of 8, resolved into something that had structure. Rhythm. Pause and resume. Like the slow breathing of something very large. We sent a second transmission. Pure tone. No words. 14 minutes later, our tone returned with the same structured static layered beneath it. We sent a third transmission with deliberate errors encoded. 14 minutes later it came back, errors corrected. Whatever was intercepting and returning our signals was not doing so passively. It was processing them. That was when Voss opened the sealed crates. The crates did not contain the equipment listed in our briefing documents. They contained files. 62 manila folders, each stamped with a date and a red diagonal line across the cover. The red line, Voss told me later, was an internal classification marker meaning, previous attempt incomplete. The oldest file was dated 1912. I read the 1912 file while Voss read the others. It was an expedition record in the format of a ship's log. A Norwegian vessel. 8 men. The same coordinates. The same silence, the same inverted compass lean, the same geometric temperature drops. They had lasted 9 days before turning back. The final log entry, written in a hand that had grown increasingly erratic across the preceding pages, read in translation. The measurements are listening. We have been measuring it for 6 days and it knows. It is not the same after knowing. Something about the act of being measured has changed it, or changed us, or changed the relationship between a measurer and a thing measured, and I do not know which, and I do not think the distinction matters anymore. We leave at dawn. 3 of the 8 made it back. Then I saw the barometer. Mauer's sealed mercury instrument, placed on the equipment table an hour before. The mercury was moving upward. Not with temperature or pressure change, those physics I understood. The mercury was climbing the tube against gravity, with the deliberate steadiness of something being drawn rather than pushed, forming a perfect meniscus at the very top of the tube. Convex. Something above the instrument was pulling it toward itself. Something above the instrument wanted it. Maurer came back in, looked at the barometer and said nothing. He sat down, opened his notebook to a fresh page and began writing. He wrote for 3 hours without stopping. The 1912 documents described a sound. We heard it for the first time that night. It was not a sound the Arctic makes. It was a sound the Arctic was being forced to make. There is a specific way that soldiers respond to the impossible. They do not scream immediately. They stand very still and wait for a rational explanation to arrive. It is a trained reflex. It can take several minutes. Sometimes it never happens at all. Brandt had been in my unit for 3 years. He was 26, from Dusseldorf, careful with equipment and reckless with cards, and he had a habit of humming old church hymns while he worked that everyone pretended to find irritating and secretly found comforting. He stepped outside the camp perimeter at approximately 2,200 hours to relieve himself. He did not come back. We found him at 2240, 200 meters northeast of camp, standing upright. Mid-stride, 1 foot slightly ahead of the other, weight forward, arms loose at his sides. In the posture of a man who had simply stopped moving instantaneously between one step and the next. Like a photograph. Like something had paused him. I reached him first. I put my hand on his arm. He was warm. Not frost warm, actively warm, as though something was generating heat through him. His eyes were open and moving. Not darting, not panicked. Tracking. Moving with controlled deliberateness, looking at something above him that the rest of us could not see. His face was not frightened. It was the expression of a man watching something so large that fear hasn't found its footing yet. The pre-fear, the enormous blank wonder of a thing beyond category. We dragged him back to camp. He was rigid but not stiff. His muscles weren't locked, they were simply refusing, with complete and calm consistency, to respond to anything other than whatever held them. We laid him in the tent. Voss checked his pupils, his pulse, his temperature. 39 degrees. Pulse 52. Slow. Deliberate. Like something was timing it. It took 4 of us to keep him horizontal. Not because he fought us. Because he kept trying with quiet and absolute determination to sit up and face northeast. At 23:10 he spoke. What? In the flat, depressurized voice of a man reporting data. It has an inside. Then he lost consciousness. He recovered physically within hours. But he did not speak voluntarily again. Not for the rest of the expedition. Not, from what I later learned, for the remainder of his life. The radio crackled at 0100. Berlin. Our handler. The transmission was short. Brandt, Werner, warrant officer. Log is medically evacuated. Do not include in subsequent personnel reports. Acknowledge. He was 20 feet away from me in a sleeping bag, breathing. They were already erasing him. I acknowledged. In the morning we went to find where he had stood. We needed to understand how he'd gotten there, what path he'd taken. We went back in daylight and found his boot prints. Mine, Hessler's, Shell's, all present in the snow leading from camp to where Brandt had stood. All the recovery team's prints, including Brandt's own from when we'd dragged him back. But behind him, in the direction from camp, Brandt's own arrival prints did not exist. He had not walked to that spot. He had been placed there. And ahead of him, in the direction his frozen stride had been pointing, the snow showed boot prints continuing forward. His size, his tread, his gait, continuing northeast for half a mile before they disappeared into unbroken white. Prints with no return. We followed the prints the next morning. We should not have followed the prints. There are experiences the body recognizes before the mind can name them. Thresholds. Edges. Places where one thing ends and something else, something that doesn't have a word yet, begins. The prince led northeast for 600 meters and then stopped in an area of ice that looked identical to the ice around it. Same color, same surface, same albedo in the gray morning light. But the air changed. Not the temperature. The texture. 3 men described it independently as walking into warm glass. A resistance that wasn't physical, a presence that wasn't air. I pressed forward and felt it on my face first. A pressure that seemed to originate not from outside but from my own skull, a sensation exactly like the moment before a headache breaks, a sense of something tightening behind the eyes that was the body's way of saying stop without using language. I raised my hand and pressed it forward. It stopped. Not against a wall. Against a refusal. My hand didn't bounce back. It held there, suspended in the air, as if the air had decided my hand was far enough and my hand, somewhere below the level of conscious command, had agreed. I pushed harder. The pressure became cognitive. Not pain. Something more specific. A sensation as though a thought I had not finished thinking was being completed for me, corrected, redirected, like a hand on a compass needle being turned against your grip. Like my mind was being gently and irresistibly steered away from where I was trying to go. Voss was looking up. She had been looking up since we arrived at the site, and I followed her gaze, and then I understood the expression on her face. Not fear. Something purer than fear. The desolation of a person who has just realized their life's work has been rendered simultaneously meaningless and the most important thing that ever happened. The sky above the barrier was wrong. Not weather wrong. The clouds had stopped moving. Not slowed. Stopped. And through a gap in the overcast, stars were visible. Stars in daylight, which is itself wrong, but these stars were wrong in a further and more terrible way. They weren't scattered. They were arranged. A precise, dense, branching network of points forming nodes and pathways and clusters that repeated at smaller scales within themselves, fractal and deliberate and deeply, recognizably organic. Voss grabbed my arm. Her fingers were shaking. That pattern, she said. I've seen that pattern. She had published it in a private academic paper in 1931. A neural firing map, the electrochemical pathway geometry of a human brain under acute trauma. She had mapped it herself from clinical data from the dying. And it was above us, in the stars. Her own unpublished research, reflected back from the sky over an Arctic barrier in 1933. Private Wenger walked into the barrier fully. He was across it before anyone could grab him. It happened in the space of a single step. He was gone for 11 seconds. Then he was back on our side, apparently unharmed. We surrounded him. His hair had gone white, not frosted. White. The complete loss of pigment that takes years of shock or illness to produce, accomplished in 11 seconds. He looked at us with the careful attention of a man who has just discovered he is in a room with strangers who think they know him. He whispered coordinates. A city, a street number, a building designation. None of it matched any city any of us could identify. He whispered it 4 times and then fell silent and did not speak for the remainder of the expedition. I pressed both palms flat against the barrier and looked up. The sky cracked. Not the clouds. The sky. A dark fracture line spread outward from the point directly above my hands, branching at irregular intervals like ice breaking on a frozen lake, moving faster than ice breaks, sealing itself even as it spread. The crack was dark, not the darkness of cloud, not the darkness of space. The darkness of a surface. Through it, before it sealed in less than 4 seconds, I saw texture. Layered, irregular, vast. The way grain runs through ancient wood, the way muscle fibers run beneath skin. Something on the other side of the sky had a surface. And the surface was curved. And it was moving. Slowly. The way the chest of a sleeping thing moves. The sky healed itself. The fracture sealed. The clouds resumed moving as though nothing had interrupted them. The sky healed itself. But I had already seen what was behind it. And it had already seen me. The worst revelations are delivered calmly. Hysteria can be dismissed. Flat certainty cannot. Maurer had been writing continuously for 31 hours. He came to the mess tent on the morning of day 7, placed his notebooks on the table, sat down across from me, and delivered his conclusions in the voice of a man reading a train schedule. No tremor. No effect. The voice of someone who has passed through the far side of terror and arrived at something that has no name but feels, he would later write, like clarity. The Arctic is not a location, he said. It is a region. He paused, choosing his words with the care of a surgeon choosing instruments. A region of the body of something incomprehensibly large. The entire ice shelf, Everything visible, everything mapped, everything we have called the high Arctic, is approximately equivalent to a section of outer membrane. The barrier is not a wall. It is skin. Silence. The tent fabric pressed and released in the wind. The gravitational pulse is a heartbeat, he continued. The radio interceptions are not interceptions. They are the response of a system to stimulation, nerve response. When we transmitted, we stimulated. What returned was reflex. The temperature cycling, the compass deviation, the inverted geological strata, all consistent with the biology of an organism of sufficient scale that our entire expedition, this ship, this ice shelf, the ocean beneath it, is housed within it. We are not on it. We are in it. We are, in the most precise biological sense, inside a living body. Voss made a sound beside me. Not a gasp. Something smaller. The specific sound of a person's understanding of the world rearranging itself, which is not a dramatic sound. It is very small. How large? I said. Maurer looked at the ceiling of the tent. Large enough that it does not move because it does not need to. It is not here. It is everywhere we have ever been. Every ocean, every continent, every depth. We are not living on a planet. We are living inside something that was here before the first ice age and will be here when the sun goes cold. It is not sleeping. It is not dormant. He met my eyes. It is patient. Petrov was at the tent entrance. I had not heard him come in. He was holding a document, folded, Cyrillic covered, official. He looked at Maurer, then at me. 1921, he said. Soviet expedition. Same coordinates. They lasted 4 days. They did not publish findings. He looked at the document. I was instructed never to let this be read. He held it over the stove flame. It caught quickly. He held it until the heat reached his fingers, then dropped it and watched it finish burning without moving his eyes away. The 1912 files had been a test. A way of assessing how long a team could function after exposure to the knowledge. We were not the second attempt. We were, based on the file dates in the crates, at least the seventh. Every government with Arctic access had sent someone. None of the returning personnel reports existed. All had been erased. I went outside to breathe. Maurer followed me. He walked to the barrier site and stood at its edge. He tilted his head, listening. Then he turned to me slowly. His face was the calmest thing I had seen in 7 days, which made it the most frightening. There are voices, he said. Human voices. Hundreds maybe. Different languages. All saying the same word. He looked back at the barrier. I don't speak them all. But the ones I recognize. He stopped. Started again. They mean, contained. Or held. Or enclosed. His jaw worked briefly. We are not the first people to be inside this thing. We may be the first to understand what we are inside. He pressed his ear back against the barrier. A man listening through the wall of the universe for the sound of what lives on the other side. The gravity pulse arrived on schedule. A deep shudder in the ice beneath my feet, 37 seconds long, as regular as breathing. As inevitable as breathing. As indifferent to us as breathing is indifferent to the cells it sustains. We were not explorers. We were not soldiers. We were, in the most precise biological sense of the term, bacteria. And the body had noticed us. Revelation is the most efficient weapon I have ever encountered. No bullet is required. No explosion. Only truth, the right truth, the wrong size truth, the truth that does not fit inside a human skull without breaking something structural on the way in. It took 36 hours for the team to come apart. 36 hours, which I have since come to think of as a reasonable amount of time for 12 men to hold together after being told they are living inside a god. The first to break were the 3 who chose the barrier. Privates Newman, Jessler, and a man I knew only as Hawk. All 3 walked to the barrier site together at 0400 on day 8, before sunrise, while most of us slept. They did not take equipment. They walked with the determined, unhurried purpose of men who have decided something irrevocably. They crossed. Hawk emerged from the other side within 2 minutes, pale and shaking, and walked back to camp without speaking and sat in a corner of the supply tent staring at his hands. Newman and Jessler did not emerge. Not in the 2 hours we stood at the barrier calling their names. Not ever. The space they had occupied simply did not contain them anymore. There was no drama. They were there, then they were not, and the barrier held its surface between us and wherever they had gone with perfect, total indifference. Corporals Fisher and Ram burned the equipment depot at 1100. They worked together, methodically, soaking supply crates in fuel. Fisher was screaming, not in fear but in the voice of a man demanding a response, the voice of a child striking something massive and immovable and continuing to strike it simply because stopping feels like accepting defeat. Feel something, he was screaming. Feel something, feel it. Ram was silent, watching the flames with an expression of almost academic satisfaction. I pulled Fisher back. Ram walked north without being instructed to do anything, without his coat, and we lost sight of him within 4 minutes. Petrov left camp at noon. He walked north at a measured pace. When I called after him, he turned once and looked at me, and the expression on his face was something I had not expected. Peace. Complete, substantive peace. The peace of a man who has set down a weight he has been carrying for a very long time. He was smiling. Not the smile of a man who has lost his mind. The smile of a man who has been given an answer he was afraid to receive and has found it barely bearable. He walked north. He kept walking. I let him go. Voss did not leave. But she stopped speaking. She found every surface in the camp that could hold writing. Her notebooks were full, so she used equipment labels, tent canvas, her own forearms with a grease pencil, and she wrote. Not findings. Not equations. Memories. Her mother's face. A recipe for kartoffel salad. A poem she'd memorized as a child. Her sister's address. The names of every patient she had ever treated. She was filling herself up. Against something that wanted to empty her, or against the void the knowledge had carved inside her, she was filling every surface she could reach with evidence that she had lived, that specific things had happened, that she was a person made of particulars and not just a body inside a body inside a body. Brant sat facing the barrier. He had walked there without prompting in the early afternoon and sat down cross-legged in the snow, facing northeast, and declined, without aggression, without effect, simply with absolute physical refusal, to leave. I tried to pull him up. He didn't resist. He simply resumed sitting when I let go. 4 times I tried. The 5th time I crouched in front of him and looked at his face, and for the first time since his episode he was smiling. A different smile from Petrov's. Petrov's had been relief. Brant's was the smile of a man who is home. I made the decision to retreat at 1,500 hours. I made it alone. The radio crackled as I was organizing what remained of our equipment. Berlin. The handler's voice. The message was brief. Bring only the documents. Leave personnel. Evacuate by 1800 or evacuation window closes. Acknowledge. Leave personnel. As though the men still on the ice were equipment to be written off. As though Brant, sitting in the snow with his private smile, was a broken instrument to be abandoned in the field. I acknowledged. I loaded the documents. I told myself in the confusion I had lost count of who remained. I tell myself that still, sometimes late at night. I walked south. At 300 meters I turned back once. Brant was still there, still sitting, still facing northeast. But his shadow, cast long by the low Arctic sun behind me, was not his shape. It spread across the snow in a vast, dark geometry that had no relationship to the seated man that cast it. Too many angles, too many branches, a shape borrowed from something that was using his outline as a rough template and not bothering to be precise about it. The shadow of something that did not have a human shape, wearing a human shadow the way a man might borrow a coat that does not quite fit. I did not look back again. I have spent the last 40 years trying to determine whether that was wisdom or cowardice. I have concluded it was neither. It was simply survival. The thing does not punish survivors. It saves them, the way we save a letter. To read again later at its leisure. I have lived inside it my entire life. The only thing that changed on that ice is that I learned the word for what I lived in. The debriefing room in Berlin was on the same sub-basement level as the briefing room. Whether it was the same room I cannot be certain. Rooms without windows tend to resemble each other. The officer who met me was a different man from the one who had sent us out. He was younger, and he asked no questions about the missing personnel, and he had on the table in front of him a pre-written report, 20 pages, complete with appendices, describing a failed meteorological survey, equipment lost to weather, crew casualties by exposure, expedition abandoned at day 4. He had already dated it. He slid it across the table with a pen. I read every page. Not out of resistance. Because I wanted to see what the story looked like when you removed the truth from it. What remained was a collection of plausible, coherent, forgettable events involving men who had never mattered in a place that had never been anything. I signed it. The officer took it without looking at me and said I could go. I went home to Cologne. I found an apartment. I found work. I was 31 years old and I lived quietly for 43 more years, watching the world fill up with its ordinary catastrophes. A war that swallowed the decade after my expedition, a rebuilding that swallowed the decade after that, a slow prosperity that covered everything like new ice over old darkness. I did not discuss the Arctic. I did not read the coverage of the International Geophysical Year in 1957, when 17 nations jointly mapped the polar regions with unprecedented precision, though I bought the newspaper that day and held it for a while before folding it back. I knew what they would not find. I knew what would not allow itself to be found. I kept a world map on my wall. I bought it in 1949 and never replaced it. Every morning for 30 years I looked at it while I drank my coffee. Nations, oceans, coastlines and mountain ranges and the pale blue of open water. The flat, authoritative certainty of a mapped world. I looked at it and I thought every morning the same thing. This is a surface. Just a surface. The way the skin of an arm is a surface. The way bark on a tree is a surface. Interesting, detailed, full of information about what it covers, but a surface. Below it, something else entirely. Above it, the sky that cracked in 1933 and showed me what lives behind it, and that has long since healed and carries on providing the illusion of limit, of edge, of the end of things. Voss survived. I learned this in 1961 from a mutual professional contact. She was teaching in Zurich. She had published papers on glaciology, on atmospheric science, on the mathematics of large-scale geological systems. Good papers. Respected. Nothing in them from the expedition. I wrote her a letter once. She did not respond. I think this means she is doing what she needs to do, keeping the knowledge in a room with no windows and not looking at it more than she has to. Bran I do not know. There is no record of him after 1933 that I can find, which means the record was managed. This is the cleanest possible outcome. It means someone decided that whatever he became was not a public problem. I try not to think too carefully about the other possibilities. I think about Maur's voices. The hundreds of human voices in the barrier, in all those languages, all saying the same word, contained. I think about the fact that every human civilization has produced, independently, a mythology about the world being held, being cradled, being inside something vast and intentional. I used to think this was the mind's way of managing the terror of open space. I now think it is the mind's way of correctly identifying its situation. We have been telling the truth about ourselves and our myths for as long as we have made myths. We simply could not bear to believe we were being literal. The question I return to, the question I have no language to answer and suspect no language exists to answer, is this. If something vast enough to contain an entire world is alive and patient and aware, what are we in relationship to it? Did it create the conditions for our existence deliberately? Are we a thought it is thinking, a dream it is having, a sensation it is experiencing the way we experience warmth? Are we an infection it has assessed and chosen not to address? Or are we something it has not yet fully noticed, and is noticing now, slowly, as we drill deeper and map further and press our instruments and our curiosity against its skin with increasing urgency, decade after decade, as if we are trying to wake it up? What happens when it wakes? What happens when the body finally notices that the bacteria have become curious? The world map is on my wall. I look at it every morning. It is 1975, and men have walked on the surface of the moon and taken photographs of the Earth from space, and the photographs show a pale blue sphere hanging in darkness, and everyone who sees those photographs feels something, tenderness, awe, a sense of smallness and preciousness. I feel those things too. But I also see in those photographs exactly what Maur described. A surface. Layered and irregular and vast, with texture that runs through it like grain through ancient wood. A surface that curves. A surface that, in 1933, on a January morning with a sky the color of old pewter, cracked open in front of my outstretched hands and showed me what lives on the other. The testimony ends here. The final page of the manuscript shows evidence of interruption. The pen still wet, the ink trailing off the edge of the paper. No further pages were recovered. The author's whereabouts after January 1975 are not recorded in any available document. This story is inspired by documented wartime reports, including Germany's 1938-39 Schwabenland Polar Expedition, Soviet Arctic research programs, and early 20th century Polar Survey anomaly logs, blended with Norse and Siberian indigenous folklore regarding entities beneath the ice, and dramatically expanded for narrative purposes. All characters are fictional. The horror is yours to keep.